Please be seated.
Good morning, everybody. All right, we are on. Defendants are present, represented by counsel. All 15 jurors are back, healthy and ready to go. Anything from the state before we begin?
Nothing from the state.
From Travis McMichael.
No, Your Honor.
From Greg McMichael.
No, Your Honor.
From Mr. Bryan.
Yes, Your Honor. We would ask that the court, for purposes of the record, for the rest of the trial, have the sheriff or bailiffs or whoever the court direct keep track, identify and keep track of the individuals in the public gallery in the courtroom. Not the jury assembly area, but in the courtroom. These 1, 2, 3 benches on the looking to the back of the courtroom to the right-hand side. That's my understanding in a case like this, that would be best practice. And we're asking the court to do that so that we can preserve a record of the individuals in the gallery that the jurors are able to see. And it's the only way, with the lawyers focused on the front of the courtroom and Your Honor and the witnesses, it's the only practical way to keep track of who's in the gallery and when. We were entitled to that under the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendments of the United States Constitution and Article 1, Section 1, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution of the State of Georgia, because without it, we can't make the record that we will require for appeal in the unlikely event that any of these defendants were convicted.
And for any of the parties? No, the court's position is if somebody is in the gallery here as a member of the public, that's their right to be here, and I'm not going to track individual members of the public who come in and out of this courtroom. If anybody is disruptive or there's a distraction that the court needs to address, I'll go ahead and address that, and we'll make sure that the record is clear about that. All right. I think where we were, well, I know where we were on Friday is we had the witness on the stand and we were in the middle of cross-examination. Let's go ahead and get the witness seated.
Your Honor, did we hear back from that juror who had been ill?
Yeah, so I said everybody's back and healthy.
Oh, okay, I missed that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no issues.
We do have one more matter to take up before the jury comes back. Our position is that based on Special Agent Seacrist's responses under cross-examination on Friday and based on his direct examination, we believe at this point the taking of the polygraph by Mr. Bryan, which was discussed on May 13th, I believe early in the interview process, not the results of the polygraph itself, but the fact that the polygraph was taken at this point is admissible in this case, consistent with the authorities I think that we've already provided to the court. The state has gone to unprecedented lengths, in my recollection, to have this witness, both in direct response to questions and on his own, try to characterize his opinion of Mr. Bryan's statements and demeanor, try and basically give his opinion as to whether the defendant has been truthful or not. And it is relevant under those circumstances that at the time that Mr. Bryan is speaking to him, that he has furnished the GBI with a polygraph. They have had the results. They've had a chance to review them. And they color the demeanor and conduct of Mr. Bryan for the rest of that interview.
Your Honor, Georgia law is clear that polygraphs are inadmissible unless, of course, we agree to it, and here we haven't agreed to it. I don't believe that anything that the state brought out makes the fact that he took a polygraph relevant. So I never asked Agent Seacrist about, his opinion as to Mr. Bryan's credibility, so I'm not sure where Mr. Goff is getting that from, but in any event, Judge, we would object to that.
First of all, Your Honor, we didn't have to admit the polygraph results. The case law is clear, however, that circumstances involving a polygraph are sometimes relevant and admissible before the jury as opposed to the results themselves being admissible. Second, and I am somewhat confused because the state has essentially said in their opening statement everything that's in the polygraph results. The state has, I believe, acknowledged that Mr. Bryan was unarmed. They've acknowledged that he wasn't in communication. These are, in fact, the subjects of the polygraph examination. So if the state is contending that the polygraph results, even if they came in, could somehow be prejudicial, the state is not contesting or disputing any of the findings of the polygraph examination. So there could not possibly be any prejudice even if the results came out. But that's not what we're asking for. But we do think the jury needs to know that when he's talking about Mr. Bryan and his conduct on the 13th, that that's informed by the fact that he had taken and passed the polygraph on those issues.
All right. The court reviewed the authority. First of all, the court made a pretrial ruling and a motion to eliminate that the polygraph was not to be admitted. The court has also reviewed the authority provided by the defendant. That would include the Stack case, the White case, and was it Norman, I believe. And that authority does not support the admission of the taking of the lie detector under the circumstances of this case. So I guess it could be couched in a motion. That motion is denied.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You ready to proceed with your
We are.
cross-examination?
We are.
Let's go ahead and get the witness seated. Go ahead and have a seat. Agent, when we broke on Friday, reminded you that you're under oath. Again, you are still under oath before the court. I'd also instructed you not to have any discussion about your testimony with anyone over the weekend. I assume you're able to comply with those instructions.
Yes, sir.
All right. I understand we're ready to proceed then.
We are, Your Honor. Should I go to the podium before or after the jury is brought back in?
It's up to you. I'd like to get started. Why don't you go ahead and go to the podium and we can go ahead and get started.
Yes, Your Honor.
Let's go ahead and get the panel. Watch your head.
Maybe I should find a better way to organize. One moment, Your Honor.
All rise for the jury. Please be seated.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully everybody had a good weekend and got some rest, something to eat, got relaxed. I appreciate y'all being back here. Again, I appreciate your attention to the case. We are ready to continue with the evidence. Mr. Goff. Mr. Goff.
Agent Seacrist, directing your attention to the bottom of page 5, the transcript of the reenactment. Oh, and I guess I need to give you back a copy of that. That would be helpful.
please. Thank you.
Okay. directing your attention to the bottom of page 5, the transcript of the reenactment. Roddy Bryan tells you that he doesn't know when the video starts, doesn't he?
That's correct. He states, and then you all have to figure out when I started the video.
And then he says, quote unquote, I thought it was around here.
That's correct.
Okay. And then, directing your attention to page 6, I'm sorry, directing your attention to page 6, Roddy Bryan is asking you to tell him, quote, so when does he turn around? And then you tell him where Mr. Arbery turns around. Directing your attention to the top of page 6.
That's right. At the top of page 6, he says, because I'm right behind him more, you know. And then I referenced the mailbox that was seen in the video, the blue mailbox.
Okay. And then Roddy says, quote, okay, well, he must have turned around because, well, we'll stop there. So is Roddy Bryan telling you that he must have turned around, or is he asking you whether he must have turned around?
He's asking.
Okay. To be fair, he's struggling a little bit.
I wouldn't say struggling, but he is trying to refresh and recollect his memories from 2.5 months before.
Fair enough. And then on the bottom of page 6 to the top of page 7, you have to direct him further. I'm not going to use the word lead, but you have to direct him further. You ask him, does he run by you before you get over the right-hand lane? Do you remember?
I'm asking him a question, at which point he runs by him.
In response to which Mr. Bryan tells you he had to have.
That's correct.
Which is basically telling you he doesn't really recall.
Objection, speculation.
And then again on page 7, you direct Mr. Bryan again, quote, and Ahmaud has already run back this way, unquote.
That's correct. That's a question.
And then in his response, he tells you, quote, I mean, what it feels like. I mean. Those are his words. You didn't take that to reflect uncertainty as to his recollection?
From the very beginning, Mr. Bryan indicated that he would try to the best of his ability to recall what had happened 2.5 months before. I expected there to be some difficulty in trying to remember exact specific details, so it was not a surprise to me.
Okay. Now, directing your attention to, I think it's the bottom of page 7, you're asking Mr. Bryan how fast he's going as he's trying to catch up with Mr. Arbery. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Bryan answers he doesn't think he's going more than 15. You remember that?
I don't think he says that we're not going above 15. He asked me as I'm driving and we're getting to a speed, he says, yep, right about that. And I responded, and we're about 15 now. And he says, yeah.
Okay. And then you say we're going 10 right now.
That was prior to us going 15.
Okay. In the middle of the page, you ask Mr. Bryan, how fast are you going at this point? Do you see your question?
Yes,
In the
sir,
middle
I
of page
did.
7. And his response, man, I swear I don't think it was more than 15.
That's correct.
And you say, okay. So it was pretty slow.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Bryan says, yeah. You say, okay. And then he asks, what do you got? Do you recall that question?
Yes, sir.
And so he's asking you how fast you're going at this point,
That's correct.
because you're operating the vehicle.
Because from the very beginning, I advised Mr. Bryan to direct me as how I'm driving the vehicle as he would have driven the vehicle.
All right. And then so you answer, so we're going 10 right now.
Yes, sir.
And he says, yep, right about that. Correct?
That's correct.
He's agreeing with you. And then you say, and we're about 15 now.
Yes, sir.
And he responds, yeah.
That's correct.
At this point, he's just agreeing with what you're telling him.
No, sir. I'm asking questions to gain information, and he's answering those questions. He's not just agreeing with me the whole time.
Okay. And on page 8, without going into the details as to what you're asking him about, you asked him whether he remembers something, and he tells you, quote, no, I really don't, unquote.
He
Top of
does.
page 8.
And then later on, a few lines down, he gives some a range as far as it would have happened just before I asked him.
Okay. Well, thank you for getting me to turn the page. And at this point, he tells you he thinks he remembers, or he thought he remembered something. Middle of 60% down page 8. And I'm sorry, officer, I just don't have the line numbers. He tells you, I thought I remembered. Am I correct?
That's correct.
And in that 5-line answer, can you count for me how many times he uses the word maybe?
Six times.
All right. But that indicates to you any confusion on his part or uncertainty.
In the context of what we are discussing here, it does not. His focus was not on exactly what I was asking him about, so I did not expect him to be able to remember it specifically to the exact moment in time. This was Mr. Bryan's focus seemed to be on Mr. Arbery at the time, so it wasn't unusual for him to not be able to see what it was I was asking him about.
And at this point, he basically tells you that he really needs to see the video again. On the bottom third of page 9?
Page 9?
Yeah. After he said, that will make sense, man, you ask him a question, and then at the bottom he gives you an answer, and he starts out with, I have to look at the video again. But yeah, I think I'm trying to stay on my right side of the road because I'm, quote unquote, freaked out now. Do you remember that?
I do. This question is only in relation to where in the road he is with his vehicle. So his being able to determine exactly whether he was all the way to the left, all the way to the right, into the center, needing to see the video for that kind of detail is not really relevant at this point.
Because at this point in the investigation, that's not really what you're focused on.
The detail of exactly where he was in the middle of the road was not a focus of the investigation.
And you don't know whether that's become a focus 17 months later, 15 months later, because you're a witness.
As a member of the investigative team, in our discussions, I know that where exactly he was on the road at the time he took the video is not an investigative important question.
Okay. And again, directing your attention down to hold on, I'm not ready to go there yet. And again, on page 8, your question to him is, it was either here or up here, but you remember something about traction. You remember asking that question?
Yes, sir, I do.
Because while in some respects you've told the jury that details aren't important, this detail matters to you, doesn't it?
Only to the extent that I'm trying to get him to provide the most information that he can from his memory. This question only refers to the point where he does the 3-point turn in the reenactment that we showed where he comes back out. There was 2 areas that it most likely occurred in, and that's all we were trying to determine.
Well, in the practice run, in the dress rehearsal for this, you were suggesting to Mr. Bryan that he had driven to the top of the street before turning around. You don't recall that?
No, sir.
Because that would affect how fast Mr. Bryan had to be traveling, wouldn't it?
I don't know.
Well, you know the length of the video, right?
Yes, sir, I do.
So if you can figure out where the video starts and where it stops and the number of seconds that elapse, you can get some idea of how fast things are happening. Am I correct?
I could, but if I was directing Mr. Bryan on what to do, I would have directed them to go all the way to the end of the road before we did a turnaround in the reenactment. But his memory was that he did not go down that far, and he was trying to determine which area he pulled into to do the turnaround prior to going to the end of the road.
Well, you'd agree it'd be a whole lot easier to figure out how much leading is going on here and how much direction and how much uncertainty there is if we had recorded the dress rehearsal as well.
No, sir.
Now, you asked Mr. Bryan again about a black mailbox on page 9.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Because the black mailbox matters to you.
The black mailbox is simply a reference point during the video when he picks the phone back up, as I indicated while we watched the reenactment video.
And Mr. Bryan again indicates to you that he really doesn't recall.
That's
He's
correct.
not in the top 40% of page 9?
Yes, sir. He states that will make sense.
And then on page 10, you're directing Mr. Roddy to tell you where he thinks he stopped prior to the shooting.
Are you talking about the second line?
Yeah. Are we where you stopped and parked? Are you closer?
That's not direction. That's a question. It starts with, are we? I'm asking Mr. Bryan where he thinks he is, or if we are at the location where he stopped.
And Mr. Bryan tells you, I think I'm going to be a little closer.
He actually starts off and confirms and says, yeah, and then says, I think I'm going to be a little bit closer. I think when we left the scene, I backed into the driveway.
Okay. So he's telling you he's even closer to the shooter.
I'm sorry?
So he told you he was closer to the shooter, or probably closer to the shooter.
From where we were at the point in the drive-thru, he was saying he was a little bit closer than where I had initially stopped and asked him that question.
And that's because Mr. Bryan is trying to minimize his involvement in this case. He's trying to distance himself from the shooting when he tells you that he's probably closer.
Mr. Bryan's involvement or minimization in the shooting has nothing to do with where he is at the time he stops and finishes recording. His minimization had occurred earlier in the process of chasing Mr. Arbery out of his driveway.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that. And then you say this is, quote unquote, kind of where you take that final video of the shots.
That's correct.
And he says, I'd say, quote unquote, probably about right there.
After he directed me by saying, I'd say a tad more up front, indicating for me to pull forward a little bit. And then he says, I'd say probably be right about there.
Okay. And then Roddy says at the bottom of page 10, quote unquote, I'm guessing here, man.
That's correct.
And again on page 11, again on where he is, Mr. Bryan tells you, I don't know. I don't recall exactly. But I want to say, not until I stopped. I'm sorry. When you ask him about when he first saw the gun, when he first saw a firearm, what does he tell you?
I don't know. I don't recall exactly, but I want to say not until I stopped.
All right. Hopefully no more transcripts this morning. My next question is this. Regardless of what Roddy Bryan told you or said to anybody else in the months before, we know that Mr. Bryan walked to his garage to get his keys, don't we?
I don't recall the video specifically. He didn't run, but if it was walk, it was a quick walk.
Okay. Because you can count the number of seconds on the video, all right?
You could.
Okay. And when you do that, he's obviously not running.
I'd agree.
Okay. So if he told somebody he was running, that would have been incorrect.
I agree.
Okay. And we know that Mr. Bryan, whatever he may have said to someone over the months before, we know from the Night Owl video that he walked to his truck.
That's correct.
Now, and let me be clear, you've reviewed the Night Owl video. I mean, I know that, but I have to ask.
Yes, sir, I have.
Okay. However, Mr. Brody described the position of his truck in his driveway over the course of many interviews and over several months. Whether he said straight or to the left or towards the right, we know from the Night Owl video that he's angled, your word, not mine, for lack of a better word, to the right and away from Mr. Arbery as Mr. Arbery is coming back to his house.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to any testimony about the Night Owl video's contents because the video itself will be the best evidence of that, and that video will come out in the evidence.
That's fine. Okay. Go ahead.
But some things are clear in this case from your investigation. As Mr. Arbery passed Mr. Bryan's house, did Mr. Bryan tell you that Mr. Arbery called out to him, please call 911, there are crazy people after me?
No, sir.
Roddy Bryan told you that Mr. Arbery never said a word.
That's correct.
I believe Roddy Bryan told you that he never saw Mr. Arbery's lips moving.
I don't remember those words exactly, but he did say that Mr. Arbery never said anything during the entire incident.
Well, going back to your May 13th statement, although Mr. Bryan has said in various contexts that he heard the person in the truck speaking, when you interviewed him, it was clear that Mr. Bryan was really reading lips at that point.
I don't recall that.
You don't recall him talking about the driver of the truck's lips moving?
Not offhand, no, sir.
And he couldn't see Mr. Arbery's lips moving because Mr. Arbery's face was not directed towards him. You don't remember any of that?
Is that a question?
That was a question.
I don't remember speaking specifically as to whether or not he could see Mr. Arbery's face to see his lips moving or not.
Okay. Now, I believe you've... did Mr. Bryan report Mr. Arbery as he's passing in front of his home making any gestures toward him? Like, help?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, Mr. Bryan is out on his front porch at this point, right?
That's correct.
And music is playing.
Yes, sir.
And the closer Mr. Bryan gets to the garage, the louder that music gets.
I would say that's believable. Yes, sir.
Because that's where he told you the music was coming from.
Yes, sir.
Okay. His garage door is open.
That's correct.
Okay. And his driveway is parked out in the front on the driveway, right?
His truck?
Yeah.
That's correct.
What, if anything, had Roddy Bryan done at this point to convey to Mr. Arbery any hostile intent?
I don't know that Mr. Arbery would have even seen Mr. Bryan at this point.
Well, we can speculate as to what he saw or didn't see. But what I'm saying is, from the person vantage point of Mr. Arbery on the street, there's a white dude working on his front porch with the car in front and the garage door open and music playing, right?
That's correct.
Is there anything else about that scene to suggest that Mr. Bryan bears any ill will or hostile intent towards this gentleman?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, I'm trying to figure out who's jumping to assumptions here. It feels like, from the statement you obtained from Mr. Bryan, that it's Mr. Arbery who's assuming the worst about Mr. Bryan.
And I'm going to object to that, Judge, as speculation.
I'll rephrase it.
Good question, please.
What, if anything, from the point where Mr. Arbery comes to his front yard, passing one set of bushes, crossing across the driveway, and out of view to the other set of bushes, in that time frame, which is on the Night Owl video, but as to which you've interviewed Mr. Bryan, what, if anything, does Mr. Bryan do? What, if anything, does Mr. Bryan say? What, if anything, does that picture suggest to Mr. Arbery that he could not seek help?
In Mr. Bryan's statement, he actually says that he hollers out to the truck, y'all got him or you need help. So to me that would indicate, and he indicates that he is speaking to the truck. So that to me would indicate that he was not there to help Mr. Arbery.
And he's also indicated to you that it was obvious from the circumstances that nobody could hear.
We don't know that. He thinks that nobody could hear him because his music was playing. But you're asking me, what would have Mr. Arbery have seen from the road? Now, we don't know what Mr. Arbery would have heard, but needless to say, his words were directed to the truck as, do y'all have them or do you need any help?
Okay. Do you recall from your interview with Mr. Bryan ever saying that Arbery asked him to call 911?
No, sir.
From Mr. Bryan's perspective, the events of February 23rd are, for a lack of a better term, chaotic. Would you not agree?
Objection, speculation about Mr. Bryan's perspective, Your Honor.
Well, you asked Mr. Bryan what he was doing that day and what he knew. Am I correct?
I did.
And Mr. Bryan indicated to you he wasn't in communication with anyone that day.
That's correct.
Specifically, he wasn't in communication with Matthew Albenzi.
That's correct.
He doesn't know anything about Matthew Albenzi, does he?
That's correct.
He can't, because Mr. Albenzi is well up the street.
That's correct.
Okay. And you reviewed Mr. Bryan's cell phone records. You reviewed his social media. At this point, you probably know more. You may know Mr. Bryan better than Mr. Bryan knows himself. Fair enough?
I don't know if I go that far, but
Mr. Bryan is not in communication with anyone prior to the shooting.
that's correct.
He doesn't know whether Mr. Albenzi is armed.
I don't know that I ever asked about Mr. Albenzi and what Mr. Bryan knew about him.
And Mr. Bryan doesn't know that the McMichaels are armed until moments before the shooting. That's what he told me.
That's correct.
Matter of fact, Mr. Bryan doesn't even remember seeing Gregory McMichael until after the shooting, when you can see him clearly on the video in the back of the truck.
That's correct.
And Mr. Bryan's told you that several minutes elapsed before the police arrived on the scene, when we know that, in fact, it was probably a matter of seconds.
That's correct.
Mr. Bryan has told you at times that he feels like he's alone out there with Mr. Arbery.
Yes, sir. After he cuts him off, tries to block him in, he says he realizes he's with him by himself.
Okay. And when he's quote unquote cornering Mr. Arbery, he's doing that by himself.
That's correct.
And even after Mr. Bryan gets so many facts about this case wrong, facts that we can actually see on the video, you're still surprised that he struggles to recall minute details months later?
I don't think Mr. Bryan got a lot of facts incorrect. I think the general facts of the case, he was correct in his recollections. What he was incorrect on or unsure about were what I would call minor details, like I said, positioning of the road and that sort of thing. Now, if we're talking about Mr. Gregory McMichael and his remembrance of him in the truck, it's not uncommon for witnesses in traumatic events or people that see traumatic events to somehow get what's called tunnel vision, and they might miss certain aspects of an event. That's why anybody that sees any type of traumatic event, if it's multiple people, you can ask them and they'll all see something a little bit different. And that's how I would explain Mr. Bryan's recollection.
And Mr. Bryan's basically related to you without using the words that this was a traumatic event for him.
It was.
And you can hear in his breathing the fear during this encounter.
I don't recall hearing his breathing.
How many times have you listened to this video?
More times than I'd like to remember.
You and me both, but you don't recall that.
No, sir.
Okay. Now, Mr. Bryan told you why he didn't call 911. Am I correct?
Is there a transcript?
Directing your attention to page 101 of the, I think it's the May 13th transcript.
I don't have it up.
Which, I spoke too soon. I'm sorry. Directing your attention to the top or the bottom half of page 101 of the May 13th transcripts.
Yes, sir. Mr. Bryan states that he thought somebody had already called the police.
And in fact, however big an assumption that might have been, he was correct.
Objection, Judge. The speculation about him being correct.
I'll rephrase. In fact, Mr. Albensi had called the police.
That's correct.
And that would have been before Mr. Arbery ran by Mr. Bryan's house.
That's correct.
And is it fair to say that the first crime that Mr. Bryan saw that day, personally witnessed, would be Mr. Arbery trying to get in his truck?
Unless you discount the fact that somebody was trying to chase Mr. Arbery down while he was legally running, jogging down the road.
Well, obviously from Mr. Bryan's perspective, I'm not asking you what's going on in Mr. Arbery's mind, but from Mr. Bryan's perspective, the first actual identifiable crime that Mr. Bryan sees is when Mr. Arbery is trying to get in his truck.
Objection to speculation, Your Honor.
I'll move on. And it's fair to say that at the time that Mr. Bryan has told you that Mr. Arbery is trying to get in his truck, that at that point Mr. Bryan is somewhat preoccupied.
Preoccupied how?
Well, he's trying to pull his vehicle away so that Mr. Arbery, that's what he told you, he's trying to pull away The fastest he's traveled the whole time is to create distance between himself and Mr. Arbery.
If Mr. Bryan was that concerned and scared about Mr. Arbery, he never would have angled to the left onto that driveway to try to box him off or cut him off to begin with. If Mr. Bryan was truly concerned about his safety with Mr. Arbery, he would have stayed to the right side of the road and stayed ahead instead of turning off to the angling to the left to box him in.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer. But getting back to the issue of Mr. Bryan calling 911, at the time that Mr. Arbery's prints are on the side of his car and that he's told you that he's trying to come in the door, is it fair to describe Mr. Bryan at that point as being somewhat preoccupied?
Preoccupied with trying to chase down Mr. Arbery, hence him coming out of the driveway like he did and following him through the ditch or next to the ditch and then up next to the tree. I would say yes, he was preoccupied.
I'm sorry. Again, directing your attention back to the 911 call, or the lack thereof. You're not trying to suggest to the jury, notwithstanding all this other stuff you want to talk about, you're not trying to deny that it was impractical for Mr. Bryan to call 911 literally while Mr. Arbery is attempting to get in his truck.
At the exact moment that that is happening, probably not. But there were moments before and there were plenty of moments after where he could have made that phone call.
And that's obvious from the video, right?
It is.
Okay. And again, directing your attention to page 101, Mr. Bryan expressed regret to you over Mr. Arbery's death.
He did.
Okay. And in fact, he told you. Whether that was for whatever reason, he said that he wished he had stayed on his front porch.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, because it's come up, yeah, it may come up again. After Mr. Arbery and this white truck are going off screen, Mr. Bryan goes in his house. Am I correct? We see him on the video going in his house. He tells you he goes in the house.
That's correct.
Okay. He goes inside his house to get, what did he tell you went inside to get?
His keys.
Now, at the time that Mr. Arbery goes by his house, Mr. Bryan already has a weapon handy, doesn't he?
I don't recall specifically.
You don't recall in the Night Owl video the hammer laying on the front porch next to where he's holding the board that he's trying to put up on his front porch?
Not offhand.
Okay. You don't recall asking him about the hammer?
I don't.
Okay. But in the video, you can see that Mr. Bryan, when he walks to the garage, he's not carrying anything.
That's correct.
He's left his hammer, he's left all his tools behind.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
And he's gone in the house to get his keys, correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Bryan leaves his gun, his rifle, inside the house.
Yes. Inside the back bedroom, I would say a good distance from where his car keys were located.
Mr. Bryan doesn't own a handgun, am I correct?
From his statements, that's correct.
Well, you subsequently checked, did you not?
There's no way to check if somebody owns a handgun necessarily.
Okay, but you can check registrations.
There's no registration in the state of Georgia. You can find a purchase through the ATF, but there's no formal registration for firearms.
Did ATF records ever show that Mr. Bryan purchased a handgun?
We didn't check ATF records. Typically, in my experience with ATF, you have to have a firearm and serial number to run the check. You can't just do it off of a name.
Okay. And where's Mr. Bryan's rifle today?
I have not checked the evidence receipts. I just know the exact location, but if it's where it was, where I'm guessing you're going with this, it's in our custody.
Okay. Did you ask for, or to your knowledge, was any forensic examination conducted of this firearm?
I was not in charge of testing evidence or determining evidence that would go to the lab.
The reason none of this is being done is because it was obvious that Mr. Bryan, when he tells you that he was unarmed that day, it's obvious that he was unarmed.
I believe that's correct. Yes, sir.
And believe it or not, I have no further questions for you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Anything from the remaining defendants?
Not from Travis McMichael.
No question.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Seacrist, Mr. Goff asked you about Mr. Bryan expressing regret in your May 13th interview with him. You remember that?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
So just to be clear, that was 3 months after the incident, right?
That's correct.
And that was after the McMichaels had already been arrested.
That's correct.
Okay. And that was after the media got a hold of the video and it became this big thing.
That's correct.
That he's expressing regret.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I don't know if you remember, it's been a weekend, but on Friday, Mr. Goff asked you about all this media presence and maybe threats that the defendant had been getting, or his fiance. You remember that?
I do.
Okay. At any point, did you, Agent Seacrist, use any of those, protests or supposed threats to influence Mr. Bryan into giving you a statement?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Did you use that to your advantage in any way?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So you also testified that you wanted to look at this case with a pair of fresh eyes. You remember testifying to that?
Yes, ma'am.
When Mr. Goff was asking you about why you noted Mr. Bryan as a witness in the May 11th interview?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Have you reviewed Officer Minshew's body cam interview with Mr. Bryan?
I have.
Okay. Have you reviewed Investigator Lowry's recorded interview with Mr. Bryan?
I have.
Okay. Were you able to pinpoint how many actual minutes or hours of interview time, meaning actual speaking, was going on in those two interviews?
If you were to take off called dead air time where nothing's being said, or Mr. Bryan was just sitting in the room by himself, the interview with Detective Lowry was actually 20 minutes long, and the first part of that was really just filling out a consent form. I don't recall the exact amount of time for Deputy Minshew on scene, but it was not very long, and a large portion of it, or I shouldn't say large, a significant portion of it was trying to figure out the video and how to get it emailed to an investigator, and then the substantive part of the interview was very spatial. He went down here, he went this way, and so it's hard to tell from watching the video. So overall, I would say by far less than 30 minutes of interview time with Mr. Bryan by the time that we got the case.
Okay. And for your two interviews with him, and counting the reenactment video, about how many hours did you spend with Mr. Bryan?
Overall, it would be approximately 5 hours or more.
Okay. Compared to the 30 minutes you said with Glenn County PD?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, is that what you meant when you said you wanted to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay. And did you then go ahead and look, okay, how does this match up to what he told Glenn County PD?
Yes, ma'am.
Was that important to your investigation?
Very important.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Mr. Goff, anything on those matters?
Yes, Your Honor.
The media influence that was out there from May 11th to May 13th, whether you created it or not, it was there.
It was there.
You were certainly aware of it.
I was aware that the media had spotlighted this story, yes.
And whether you did it or not, it was your agency that gave the press conference. You testified Friday. You were there as your boss was talking about this case to the media.
I was there.
Okay. Now, obviously, you don't tell the GBI director how to run investigations. Am I correct?
That's correct.
But there's no mistake that your agency did play a role. We can quibble over how big a role, but played a role in that media storm.
By role, there would be different roles that somebody would play. In this case, though, we were not the driver of that media. We were simply responding to the media requests.
All right. Now, you've indicated that you went back and tried to estimate the length of other interviews.
Yes, sir.
Is transcript length one indication of how long an interview is?
It could be.
Okay. Well, directing your attention to, every time I think I'm done with transcripts, they keep coming back. Directing your attention to your May 11th.
The transcript of your May 11th conversation with Mr. Bryan.
How long is that transcript?
In pages, it is 105 pages, 106 pages.
And directing your attention, you can give that one back, and we're going to trade out, okay? I'm going to give you the May 13th transcript. And how long is that transcript, sir?
103 pages.
All right.
And those transcripts cover almost 4 hours?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you've indicated you reviewed the transcript of the Minshew body cam.
That's correct.
And that's approximately 54 pages.
I don't recall specifically, but
We are.
Should be over here on the side.
Miss Olivia.
It should be. The copies that were on the exhibit.
My apologies, Your Honor. I'm trying to find tender documents.
Unless someone needs them. Let's see. Here's the 23rd one.
Okay.
Okay. And then she body cam. Okay. Just put it back whenever you're done. Okay.
Sir, directing your attention to Exhibit 195A. That's the Lowry interview transcript.
yes, sir.
How many pages is that?
20 pages.
All right.
And directing your attention to 228A, the Minshew body cam video. Can you tell me how many pages that is?
52 pages.
52 pages.
The difference with the Minshew body cam video, though, is there's much more in here than just the interview with Mr. Bryan. It also includes conversations between officers, with dispatch over in the background, so it's more than just the interview.
Indeed. Thank you, sir.
Would you not agree, Agent Seacrist, that the length of an interview and the length of the discussion are not directly related?
I would agree.
Other officers covered the same subjects that you covered. They may have done so quickly, but they covered the same ground. Did they not?
We covered the same ground as it related to the facts, but I would say my interviews dealt more into detail regarding some before and after the fact, and also some more specific questions during the incident. But the same set of facts, yes.
Well, there's no question. You are. Do you know any police officers who are more thorough than you are?
Yes, sir, I do.
You do?
I do.
Okay. All right. Is it fair to say you consider yourself a thorough police officer?
That's my goal.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Now, in the Minshew body cam video, Mr. Bryan goes back over the events 3 times?
I don't recall specifically, but I'll go
Something
with
like
it.
that? And Lowry at least twice?
I don't recall those specifics. So.
And you read the entire Glenn County Police report, haven't you?
I have not.
Oh, okay. So you don't know how many other interviews took place that weren't recorded, such as by Detective Lowry on the scene?
I'm not aware.
Okay. Now, in any of the statements that you've reviewed that Mr. Bryan has ever made, he's adamantly denied having a firearm at any point on this day.
That's correct.
Okay. And certainly if Mr. Bryan were brandishing a rifle in his pickup truck while he's taking a video, how many hands does Mr. Bryan have?
2.
Kind of hard to hold a gun, hold the steering wheel, and move a car while you're taking a video.
That's correct.
There's no doubt that whatever other people in this case may have done, Mr. Bryan came out there armed only with his cell phone.
And his vehicle.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, Agent. You may step down. Yeah, why don't you just leave them up there? I'm not sure whose transcripts those are and whether they're exhibits or not. Agent, you are you're free to go, but you are subject to recall.
Yes.
Thank you. My thought is to get started.
Maybe have a courtesy break at this time,
Okay, or we can do that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and take a 15-minute recess, and we'll get back to the evidence in just a moment. Thank you.
It's all right for the jury.
All right, let's take 15 minutes. We're in recess.